Good morning, everybody. My name is Etta Post. I am the retired director of the American Jewish Committee, and I have the great pleasure to welcome to Temple Beth Shalom. I have the great honor of introducing the current president of the American Jewish Committee in Sarasota, the west coast of Florida. And she is currently an attorney, soon to be retired, and is the current president of the American Jewish Committee. She is a local lawyer in town, and also I found out that she was from Cleveland and was there the same time that I was, and we knew people and had things in common but we didn't know each other. So I'm happy to say that we have remedied that. So I think you're going to have a wonderful time. She's going to speak today about David Harris, who is the Executive Director of the National Chapter of the American Jewish Committee.
Thank you, Etta, and thank you, Temple Beth Shalom, for having me here. What I thought I would do is speak about, my plan is to speak about David Harris, who has been the Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee nationally since 1990. But in order to give his biography some meaning, I'd like to put it in context and share with you some information and stories about the American Jewish Committee. I thought I would speak for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we can have questions or discussion, and hopefully you'll all still be awake. AJC, American Jewish Committee, is often called the State Department of the American Jewish community. And to kick it back to the very beginning, in around 1906, which was the year AJC was founded, word came to the United States about the pogroms that were taking place in Tsarist Russia. And we know the word pogroms, but what they were was really anti-Jewish riots, where Christian people would get together in gangs with axes and torches and run riot through the Jewish neighborhoods, burning down shops, burning down homes, invading synagogues, desecrating Torahs, and pulling Jewish people out of their homes and hiding places, and killing them, torturing them, and mutilating them. In the early part of the 1900s, 20th century, the Jewish community of Russia was able to get word out to the international media so that word of this hit the papers all over the world, in London and in the United States in particular. In the United States, a small group of prominent Jewish men, because at that time it was men, not that there's anything wrong with that, banded together and decided that they needed to organize to help the Jews in Russia, and in general to help vulnerable Jewish communities, to influence the United States government and international public opinion, and to send a message that countries like Russia and regimes could not freely kick around the vulnerable Jewish communities there. In doing this, as you know, they were following a long tradition in Jewish communities throughout the world, throughout the centuries, of helping our own brethren in need when they need us. I thought it was interesting or moving that the first official seal adopted by the AJC in 1906 took as its motto the Hebrew motto from the Battles of King David, which translates to, "Be of good courage, and let us prove strong for the sake of our people." AJC at that time began its campaign against restrictive immigration laws in the United States, which prevented Jews from finding a home here, and they also raised and distributed funds for the Jewish community of Russia. From the very beginnings, AJC was distinctive in that it was a small group. It did not seek publicity for its activities. The aim then as now was to get things done as effectively as possible, not to promote the renown of the organization or its leaders. It preferred working behind the scenes with contacts, influence, and coalitions. From then till now, AJC has become an international think tank and advocacy organization. It works to identify and address problems early and to address them through diplomacy at the highest levels of government and community relations. AJC's approach includes building coalitions across national, ethnic, and religious lines to pursue joint strategies. Today, I'd like to focus on the last 60 or 70 years of AJC's activities because that's how David Harris fits into the picture. As many of you know, to understand the American Jewish community and activity in the last 60 years, one has to make reference to World War II and the experience there. During and after World War II, the American Jewish community felt particularly ineffective as a political factor in the United States, unable to affect the course of events affecting the Jews of Europe. Before World War II, the American Jewish community addressed anti-Semitism around the world on an emergency basis, as they did with the pogroms. After World War II, there was a resolution to try to affect things more preventatively. They spent more time and attention to the prevention of the transmission of anti-Semitic attitudes to younger generations. So more focus was placed on education and intergroup relations. After World War II as well, AJC decided it was important to increase its presence overseas. They were the first American Jewish organization to establish an office, a permanent office in Berlin, because they felt it was important to be present there, to see exactly what was going on, and to have a hand in prevention of more anti-Semitism. And after World War II, instead from being a small group of prominent Jewish people, AJC established chapters in various cities throughout the country, including our chapter here is one. It also became a guiding principle of AJC that Jews are not safe in a world where any minority group is unsafe. The specific Jewish aspect of this principle is that because of our history, because of what the Jews had suffered, Jews have a special privilege and responsibility to help all of humankind fight for human rights and civil rights. It also was grounded in a belief that anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry of all forms has the same root cause. It's the same single-minded kind of hatred with a single cause. And in this light, there is no difference between helping Jews and helping other minority groups, just as there is no difference in helping Jews in the United States and Jewish communities overseas. If one of us suffers, we all suffer. And if one of us is unsafe, we all are unsafe. So to give you just a few stories and examples of what AJC has done, because the breadth is so wide that I think it helps to understand just by knowing a few of the activities. As many of you recall, in the 50s and 60s, segregation was the norm in the American South. AJC, in keeping with its principle that if one minority is threatened, we all are, became an active advocate in the civil rights movement. During this period also, anti-Semitism was flourishing in the South, and throughout the South, in addition to blacks-only signs, you would see signs in hotels in Miami Beach, Jewish people not welcome, or Hebrews not welcome. AJC was an activist in the civil rights movement, and some of its own members in the South criticized this activity because they felt that they would be targeted and unsafe because of AJC's involvement. And in fact, either because of the civil rights advocacy or plain anti-Semitism, this was an era in which many synagogues and Jewish community centers in the South were bombed and burned. At that time, the president of AJC said, "Our responsibility to the Negro is really no more or less than our responsibility to ourselves." AJC very strongly felt that no Jew could stand by and refrain from becoming involved in the civil rights movement. So, for example, in 1953, there was a convention of 15,000 Black Baptist ministers seeking to hold their convention in Miami. They could not find a hotel willing to take them. The AJC Miami chapter spoke with a lot of the hotel owners down there, a number of whom were Jewish, and a hotel was had for the convention. AJC wrote a friend of the court brief in the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education, which you may recall was the instrumental Supreme Court case that outlawed segregation in the schools, finding the holding principle there was separation is inherently unequal. Because remember, before that, it was separate but equal. AJC had conducted a study in 1950 on the impact of discrimination on children. That study was cited in Chief Justice Warren's opinion in the case. In 1962, AJC awarded its highest honor, the American Liberties Medallion, to Thurgood Marshall. He was the attorney who argued the Brown versus Board of Education case, and you'll recall he later became a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And the award was also given to Martin Luther King Jr., who accepted the award at AJC's National Conference. AJC worked nationally and locally to advance civil rights through education, research, negotiation, legislation, and litigation. Another example of an area in which AJC was very involved in the 20th century, AJC had been involved in exposing and denouncing the treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union since the era of Stalin. In the 50s and 60s, millions of Jews were caught behind the Iron Curtain. While some emigration was allowed to Israel, it was allowed only if Jews turned their backs on their lives and their families and their possessions, leaving everything behind. In Russia, Muslims, Christians, and Eastern Orthodox had beautiful churches which were constructed and maintained with state subsidies. Synagogues, on the other hand, were allowed to deteriorate. People weren't allowed inside synagogues. The Jewish communities congregated outside of synagogues. Jewish articles of any kind were forbidden. Jews could not bake or import matzahs for Passover, and Jewish cemeteries were closed by the government on the pretext that they were full or that the land was needed for construction. Here's an example of AJC activity. In 1958, there was a rumor through the media and reliable information that the Russian government was considering coercing the entire Jewish community of Russia into a particular Jewish region of Siberia, or a former Jewish region of Siberia. At that time, the Soviet First Deputy Premier, Anastas Mikoyan, was about to visit the United States. AJC representatives secured a meeting with him, which was his first meeting with an American Jewish group. They presented a detailed report outlining the conditions faced by the Soviet Jews, outlining the rumors of this forced resettlement in Siberia, and the conditions of this area of Siberia and how unacceptable they would be. Mr. Mikoyan denied the report. He denied that anything in the report was true. In the face of this denial, the American Jewish Committee made sure that there was a lot of press coverage of the meeting and his statement, so that his statements of denial were published in the media all over the world, putting him on record with that position. Once he was on record, he couldn't back down. So when he went back to Russia, that was the end of the discussion. At the next month's Communist Congress meeting, the matter was dropped and never heard from again. This is just an example of AJC behind the scenes effectively influencing the course of events. In the 1960s, the pressure that AJC brought to bear on the issue of Soviet Jewry dramatically increased. They were briefing everyone they could in the United States government and beyond, including the United States President and Secretary of State. Mass demonstrations and vigils were had, and mind you, not just by AJC, but by a number of American Jewish organizations. In the 1980s and up through then, only a few Jews were allowed to leave. This all changed 1985 onward. In 1985, Gorbachev came to power, and he had a close relationship with Ronald Reagan. Reagan, who was president at that time, had gotten the message and made it a condition of his relationship with Gorbachev that things had to change for Soviet Jewry. In 1987, the day before a Gorbachev-Reagan summit in the United States, a demonstration calling for freedom for Soviet Jewry was had in Washington. They were calling for freedom to emigrate or freedom to practice Judaism freely in Russia. That demonstration was organized and coordinated by David Harris. It drew 250,000 people. A live Russian translation of the demonstration was broadcast into the Soviet Union through the Voice of America. And that night, AJC honored Natan Sharansky, who had recently emigrated from the Soviet Union. As a result of all of these activities, between 1987 and 2005, about 1 million Jews emigrated to Israel. And now, with that background, a little bit about David Harris. Like all of us, he is a product of his family, his culture, and his era. His mother was a refugee from the Soviet Union and occupied France. His father was born in Berlin, sent to Austria for safety in 1933, then went to France and joined the French Foreign Legion because Jews were not allowed to join any other military service in France. He enlisted in the French Foreign Legion and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. They ultimately made their way to New York City, where David was born and grew up in New York City, not in a particularly religiously Jewish family, but a family that definitely knew it was Jewish. He was the first member of his extended family to be born in this country. As he says, he came to believe that it was normal for a Jew to have lived in several countries, to have experienced expulsion and persecution, to be multilingual, and to have survived. From his family's experiences, he developed a strong fighting spirit and optimism. They had adamantly refused to accept their fate passively, and they did not become prisoners of their own history. David graduated as an undergraduate from the University of Pennsylvania, and he did graduate studies in international relations at the London School of Economics and Oxford. At that time, in his youth, he had a part-time teaching job at night, teaching English to immigrants, many of whom were Soviet Jews emigrating to the United States. Because of that experience and how impressed he was with that experience, he became an exchange teacher in an exchange program in the Soviet Union, teaching English. There, he spent a lot of time with the Jewish community, congregating outside of synagogues and in Jewish homes. He was eventually detained by the KGB and expelled from the country. But that determined his course going forward. He went from the Soviet Union to Rome, where he got a job with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. He worked in Rome and Vienna working with Soviet Jews, counseling them and processing them in the first steps of their new lives in the West. The highest experience propelled him to a career in Jewish communal work. He said at that time and says now that he thinks of no higher calling than to work in service of the Jewish community. And I would just like to read to you what he said, or what he says now about that experience, which is, I think, pretty compelling. He says of his highest work, "Instead of simply imagining what I want to believe I might have done had I been alive during the Holocaust, here was my chance on my watch to do something for Jews in need. Here was the opportunity to say, yes, we Jews had learned something, however painfully, from the lessons of the Holocaust about the compelling need for Jewish self-help, skillful political organization, and abandonment of our perennial fear of provoking anti-Semitism by seeking full participation in public life." David Harris joined AJC in 1979, and except for 2 years when he was on loan to the coordination of the Soviet Jewry movement here, he has remained there ever since, becoming executive director in 1990. And I don't know if you all had the occasion to see him, but I think a number of years ago, not that long ago, he was here for a community lecture, I think at Temple Beth Shalom, wasn't it? And we will have him again. But I'd like to, before we have questions and discussion, give you one more example of the type of work AJC does, and this was something that took place under David Harris's watch. Starting back in 1950, you may recall the Arab League nations established a boycott on Israel, which included most Jewish people as well. Japan had established diplomatic ties with Israel in 1952, and it really wasn't much concerned with the Middle East. That changed after the Six-Day War because Japan, more than any other industrialized country, was dependent on foreign oil. And after the Six-Day War in 1967, the Arab League decided to blackmail Japan by forcing them to participate in the Arab boycott. As a result, because of its dependence on foreign oil, Japan reformulated its policy toward Israel. No cabinet-level figure visited Israel. Japan voted to give PLO observer status at the UN. Japan was the first major non-communist country to receive Yasser Arafat. No economic delegation of government or of commerce and Japanese companies visited Israel. El Al was refused landing rights in Tokyo, and on and on. In 1987, there was publicity in our country that several very anti-Semitic books had become very popular in Japan. And that got the American Jewish community scratching their heads because Japan hadn't really been exposed to Jewish people. There were hardly any Jewish people living there. It was an island. It was a homogeneous population. So there was concern and mystification about how did this happen. Given other compelling issues going on in the world, this might not seem like a major issue. But AJC, in its tradition of thinking forward, was concerned about Japan and knew that Japan and Asia in general were going to have a growing influence in world affairs. Other Jewish organizations issued statements denouncing this anti-Semitic literature. AJC took a different tack. It decided that its best course of action for a first step would be to gain a better understanding of the Japanese society. Otherwise, the most well-intentioned efforts might fail. So AJC spent a year learning about Japan and Japanese culture through Japanologists, through the United States State Department contacts, and from the Japanese people. At the end of this year, AJC established what it calls the Pacific Rim Institute, a learning and leadership institute addressing issues in the Asian countries. At that time, AJC made the first of 14 visits to Japan. There, the AJC delegation met with a wide group of people. The stated goal of the visits was positive. It was simply to enhance relations between Japan and the Jewish people. With each visit, the AJC team was able to reach a higher level of officials, and ultimately, the conversation was turned to Israel and relations with Israel. Ultimately, as a result of these 14 visits, the Japanese government wrote its Publishers Association criticizing these anti-Semitic books and expressing its view that these anti-Semitic books were an embarrassment to the country. In 1991, at AJC's request, Japan co-sponsored the repeal of the Zionism is Racism resolution in the United Nations. In 1992, the Japanese foreign ministers announced that Japan was no longer going to participate in the Arab boycott of Israel. When asked by the media, how did you come to this decision, he credited the patient, persistent work of the AJC for that decision. This kind of diplomacy is a two-way street. It involves advocating for AJC's position, but it also involves listening. Therefore, AJC, at the Japanese request, spoke with American baseball officials in support of a Japanese consortium's offer to purchase the Seattle Mariners, which was being opposed on purely racist grounds, and which ultimately was accepted. This story of the Japanese experience really exemplifies how AJC works. Looking at long-term issues, a willingness to patiently study and understand an issue before diving in. The approach involves perseverance, patience, and persistence. A balance of public work, advocacy, and private behind-the-scenes conversations. It involved local chapters as well, working with local Japanese consulates and Japanese communities in the United States. It involved high-level contacts in the United States and Israeli governments, contacts which AJC has worked and still works very hard to develop and maintain. And a recognition that a relationship is a two-way street. We have to build an atmosphere of trust and credibility. We have to listen, even if we don't always like what we hear. And sometimes we have to compromise. Today, Israel has three major trading partners: the United States, Germany, and Japan. And the popularity of anti-Semitic books has declined because respectable Japanese people see them for what they are, hate-filled rants, not legitimate literature. Today, AJC all over the world continues its work on the two parallel tracks that started its activities in the early 20th century, tirelessly addressing specific Jewish concerns all over the world, and working to secure and advance human rights for all minorities around the world. Virtually everything that has affected the Jewish people in the last 70 years has been advanced and influenced by AJC. Aid for distressed Jewish communities in Europe and Latin America, the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel, the movement to free Soviet Jewry, the fight for civil rights and against bigotry and discrimination in the United States, Christian-Jewish relations, Black-Jewish relations, separation of church and state. Today, AJC has 26 regional offices all over the United States. Our office in Sarasota covers the west coast of Florida from Tampa to Naples. We have 11 overseas offices, permanent offices, in places like Berlin, Brussels, Geneva, Jerusalem, Mumbai, Paris, Rome, and 31 formal international affiliations. In these current times of uncertainty for Israel, AJC's multifaceted capabilities and global diplomatic presence positions AJC to play a unique role as Israel's advocate here in the United States and around the world. If you are interested in learning more about AJC, the best place to look is our website, www.ajc.org. This week, May 2nd through 4th, AJC will be having its annual global forum, thousands of people convening at the annual conference in Washington. Many of the sessions involving leaders from all over the world will be simulcast on the web. So if you tune in to AJC's website, you'll be able to hear some of these sessions as they are taking place. And David Harris has written a number of books. Notably, he's written 4 volumes called In the Trenches, which are his selected writings and speeches, and he's a wonderful writer. I would confess to you that if you pick up any of those books and read them, some of what you read may sound familiar because I have borrowed liberally from his writings in my remarks today, with his permission, I'm sure. But I think you can get those on Amazon, and I also believe when I looked, there were 1 or 2 volumes in the Selby Library. So I'm happy to take questions and discussion, and as we go to questions and discussions, I simply want to enlist in the discussion and introduce you to Brian Lipton, who is the current executive director of our AJC regional office for the West Coast of Florida here in Sarasota. And thank you very much.
Excellent.
Very nice.
Questions?
What is the difference in policy and program between AJC and the American Jewish Congress? I always have been confused between the two.
I'm going to let Brian speak to that a little more, but I think American Jewish Congress actually at this time is no longer in existence. That's one big difference, I think. But historically, I know the approach, the American Jewish Committee's approach to issues, as I've described, is pretty unique. And I know that particularly, I mean, what I've read after World War II, for example, all of the Jewish organizations, AJC, American Jewish Congress, World Jewish Congress, Joint Distribution Committee, all were involved in rebuilding the Jewish communities of Europe and in the displaced persons camps, each in its own distinctive way, kind of fitting in together and working as a really well-coordinated universe. But I don't know, Brian, if there's...
No, I think that's a perfect answer. And
Why did the American Jewish Congress go out of existence?
you know, I don't want to really speak on behalf of an organization that I don't represent, but I think most likely it would be because of lack of support, and I certainly think that's one of the reasons why various Jewish organizations need the support of everyone. So many people will listen to such talks like Sue gave, and congratulations, that was terrific, and nod their heads and say that's great, but they're expecting somebody else to support this work, and that's why we're so grateful for the wonderful support we've gotten on the West Coast of Florida.
I will say that some of the top people, I know of one in particular, Mark Stern, who was, I believe, the General Counsel of American Jewish Congress, is now with AJC, and he will be visiting Sarasota this summer.
Absolutely.
So maybe come and ask him that.
Second week of June. So.
He'll know for sure.
Yes.
Other questions, discussion?
So what is the current relationship between AJC and the American State Department? Do they have a comfortable relationship or antagonistic?
My understanding is, and I think one thing that AJC has always made a priority and that has always been very important, is a very close relationship with members of the State Department. So I believe that that's still the case. We, as you know, on the regional board, have the privilege on numerous occasions of having conference calls with private off-the-record briefings with members of the State Department on pressing issues of concern, primarily these days around Israel, but the unrest in various parts of the country that affect the Jewish communities there. So my understanding is it's still very close. And we will let you know better after our trip to Washington, because in the Global Forum, among other things, there will be representatives of the State Department participating with us in the Global Forum, and some of our constituents will be visiting the State Department as well. So I think it's still very close.
Do you have any comments on the same issue with relationship to the current administration in Washington? How close the relationship is, whether it's antagonistic or cooperative?
It's definitely not antagonistic.
I
think there's always a relationship of some closeness and mutual respect. You've certainly seen from what we've all seen on TV that the relationship between the leadership of Israel and the relationship of our current administration, they're not the closest friends, but I think there's a relationship of mutual respect and understanding, and I think that holds with AJC as well.
As a 501c3, we're not able to really talk positively or negatively about any elected official. We're bipartisan. I think that AJC walks that line to be able to have easy access to the administration, and we've gotten a lot of questions about the upcoming election, and we're very, very careful, because whoever is in the White House, AJC needs to be able to have that access and open communication to be able to further our goals.
It goes back to that concept of, if you're going to have a real relationship, you have to give and take, even if you don't always like what you hear, and you have to compromise. And AJC, as an explicitly, as Brian said, non-ideological organization, works very hard to develop and maintain credibility with people of all political stripes, so that they can advocate whatever positions we need to advocate and have credibility, and not be viewed as, well, of course you're taking that position, you're on that side. We really need to have the trust of all the players.
Does AGC have a position on the Jewish settlements on the West Bank as a potential obstacle to peace?
Not that I am aware of. And I also think that AJC really does take the position, but you can correct me again, Brian, that we really can't interfere in the internal decisions of the Israeli government. AJC professional diplomats like David Harris are very close to people in the Israeli government, and they may have off-the-record conversations and private conversations, and they do all the time, but they have to run their country the way they think best. Have we done a good job at not answering any questions?
I think you did a wonderful job.
Very good.
Thank you so much. And even though they're not here, thank you, Etta. Thank you, Martin, for inviting me to be here. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out early.